Welcome to Unleashed, the podcast where we redefine leadership by focusing on what truly matters, the people driving change. Change leadership is about guiding people through transformation in a way that inspires them to embrace change because they believe in it. Whether you're a leader looking to foster a culture of growth or someone eager to break through barriers in life and business, this podcast is for you. Now our host, Wendi.
Welcome to the Unleashed podcast. I'm Wendi, and I'm your host today. On Unleashed today, we're going to be joined by Dr. Therese Markow, an award-winning geneticist, easy for me to say, who has held prestigious academic positions at major universities in the U.S. and abroad. As the host of the Critically Speaking podcast, Dr. Markow is passionate about breaking down complex scientific issues into everyday language, empowering people to make informed decisions for their health, communities, and also our planet. She is also the president of Sin Fronteras, a nonprofit supporting arts and science, and a dedicated advocate for women, bringing both her expertise and advocacy to the forefront of every conversation. So, Dr. Therese, welcome.
Well, thanks. Thanks for inviting me. It should be fun.
Yeah, I'm super excited to dig into what your day-to-day looks like and some of your passions. And it sounds like you just make the world better every day.
Well, that's the goal. I don't know if the goal is being accomplished or not, but we always try, right?
Well, intention is what, 75% of the accomplishment. So I'm sure that you do some amazing work.
Yeah.
So let's dig in. So, as I was getting to know you a little bit and reading your bio, and, I was curious, what inspired you to transition from mentoring students in academia to hosting Critically Speaking, a podcast where you tackle major societal and health issues to a broader audience?
Well, part of it is that, the education environment at a university has really changed over the last few decades, where a lot of students don't come to class. You're supposed to post things online for them, and sometimes they don't want to come to class, or they go to your class and take your class because they have to, because it's required for them to get a degree. And I'm not saying this is all students, but a lot of them. And, people that listen to podcasts, they listen because they want to, right? They turn it on voluntarily and they do it because they're interested. Nobody's forcing them. So that was part of it. And I thought I could just make a bigger difference, to have an audience that really was interested and wanted to be on board with it. And the other thing, in terms of mentoring, I probably still am mentoring some of my former grad students and postdocs, just, keeping in close touch with them. But the other thing that really started to get to me was the amount of fake news about science that people were buying into. Like, how can this be? So it just struck me that maybe doing the podcast would be a way to kind of address these issues.
Yeah.
So I did it. It's been fun.
I bet it's been fun. And, I talk to so many people who say, I don't know, this new generation, this younger generation, they don't want mentorship. And that just has not been my experience. What has been your experience with this younger generation? Are they leaning into mentorship? What does that look like?
Well, I think because, if you teach at a big institution like UCSD or University of Arizona, where I'd been for some time, you tend to teach large classes and you don't have that much contact with undergraduates, but you also have a research program and a laboratory that's going to be filled with grad students and postdoctoral people. And I think that's really where the mentoring comes in, is to make sure that they get a lot of really good publications, that they have confidence, that they present at meetings, that they're well connected, and that they got a lot of support for whatever problems that they're having, and just a lot of encouragement. And so that's what that looks like, I think, for most professors, regardless of what field you're in. And, in terms of mentoring others, I guess, I don't know if I do that through the podcast or not. I don't know how to answer that. I'm still in close contact with a lot of my students that we're finishing up some papers with and so forth. that's kind of where that is, you know.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited because I do see, a lot of people leaning forward and wanting to learn from the people who have already been there. There's no use reinventing
Yeah,
the wheel. So I think that's an encouragement. Just
yeah.
even I want to thank you for having the podcast because there's not a lot of people that are willing to get out there and expose truth. So I want to dig into that a little bit
Oh, oh
more.
well.
So,
Yeah,
as a scientist,
yeah.
you talk about you want to make sure that you get down to the truth of science. So,
Mhm.
what are some of the misconceptions that you most commonly see?
Um, yeah, well, I think a lot of it, there are misconceptions about a lot of different kinds of science, okay, whether it's health, whether it's the climate, whether it's, whatever it is, whether it's astronomy, they tend to, people used to get their news from watching the nightly news or reading the newspaper. And now, I mean, it's pretty clear from a lot of studies that many people get their news from social media, which means they're reading snippets of things that people are reposting, and often these things get reposted millions of times without anybody ever having really looked at the original information. And they just repost something that's really kind of like a soundbite practically. And then everybody sees this, and then that's what a lot of people believe. And I think that's detrimental for people because if they're believing things that are not true, it could be dangerous.
Well, and it's so true that confirmation bias takes hold because, and I did
Yeah.
this experiment, I don't know, it was a couple of weeks ago. I can prove whatever I want to prove in the
Right.
media.
Yeah.
If I
Right.
believe a certain way and I start to do research, guess what? I can find research that's going to back up what I believe. Does that make it truth? Absolutely not.
Right.
So how do you expose that truth and how do you choose? Because there's so much untruth out there.
Right. I know. Well, the confirmation bias, it's a good point. But I think that, what it comes down to is, look, when you're talking about science and people are not understanding what it's about and they're repeating things that are, in effect, fake news that aren't true. I think the issue lies where, as scientists, when we do our research, we publish it in academic journals. But the publication process, I've been an editor, so I know the publication process is pretty rigorous. So, a group, a professor, or a team of researchers will submit a manuscript with their results to a journal, but that journal is not automatically publishing it. It has to go out for peer review, meaning a whole bunch of other scientists look at it and say, are there flaws with the data, their interpretation, anything like this? And if it's vetted, it gets published, okay? But the work gets published in an academic journal, and there are a lot of them, and they're good, okay? But the public doesn't read academic journals. And I don't blame them. I mean, a lot of it is techno speak, and it's going to
Mhm.
be a lot of words that are specific to a particular field. And so I think that's where the gap comes in. So, my goal is to get some of these scientists on the show and then ask them about their work so that they can explain things, in basic terms for people.
Mhm.
I think that's the only way it's going to work. Otherwise, there's this mistrust, people will cast aspersions on some field and it's not true. And the scientist doesn't really ever have a chance you know, to discuss
Mhm.
what the real work was. I'm a firm believer in data. I want to see
Yeah.
data, and I want to see data that has been peer reviewed and been rigorously looked at before people start talking about what it means. So,
Well, and do you ever find through that entire publication process that by the time it's actually published, things have changed? Because I'm sure just like with technology and with the speed of information,
mhm.
we start to prove things differently and things start to change so quickly. Does that happen in science as well, that by the
Well,
time
I
it's
think
actually published, it changes?
I think not that often. The publication process is pretty rapid now. I think what happens is people learn more. I don't
Mm.
think it changes it to the point where it's not true anymore. I think what happens is you just know more. And
Okay.
I think in science that's what goes on, but it doesn't, if the publication process is a few months and now there's a way to to post your data online, I don't think that's that big a problem. And if there is some sort of a change, it's usually finding out more.
That makes sense. Expanding on it, building on it, more
Yeah,
more new information versus a complete change of direction.
right. Usually, yeah.
Interesting.
For the most part. It's not to say that doesn't happen, but
Yeah.
for the most part, it's an expansion on things.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you have lots of different scientists on your podcast.
Mhm.
Just give us an example of one of the most interesting people that you have had on your podcast that was a truth that was just enlightening, that when the truth came forward, it was just completely different than what we see in the media.
Oh, wow. Well, sometimes the things aren't actually in the media.
Mm,
Um, Sometimes it's really more of a health warning. For example, um, there is a physician researcher who I interviewed, and I'm actually going to rerun his podcast, where he had connected the fact that women shave under their arms and then put a bunch of chemicals on the shaved skin, that is associated with the development of breast cancer. So, do you think that the companies that make all the stuff you're supposed to put on your under your arms are going to tell you that maybe there's
absolutely not. They're not.
okay, right. So that's one. But another one that was recent was with Dr. Janine LaSalle. She's from UC Davis, and she and her group do imaging on brains, and they're really interested in brain development, and it's possible to do MRIs on fetal brains, which her group has done. They had published some interesting work showing that you can actually detect differences in a fetal brain that can be predictive of autism. So, whether people that are believing in vaccines causing autism want to believe this or not, fine. But if you can detect this, um, if you can detect, marks of this before a baby's born, it kind of rules out what some people are thinking, right? So that I
Yeah.
think was a really great one. That was a
Ooh.
good one. Yeah.
Well, and I know one of the things that you talked about in your intro video for your podcast was there's this rise of autism and this rise of attention deficit disorder.
Mhm.
H- Help us understand from a scientific perspective, why are we seeing a rise?
Well, Wendy, if you think about it, over the last, say, 30, 40 years, what are some of the biggest changes that you've seen that may affect humans? I'll
Well,
tell you.
probably what we eat, how we grow it, what we drink.
Yeah, what we eat, and what we eat and how much we eat leads to obesity. We have an obesity crisis, okay?
Mhm.
Well, it turns out that if you do large enough studies with people of different weights, mothers of different weights, it turns out that there's a much higher incidence of autism, significantly higher if the mother was obese. So there's one example. And obesity has been on the rise. And I think another one is just the fact that we have so many endocrine disruptors in our environment. And I don't know if you've ever looked at the labels on certain cosmetics or household products and even certain foods. If you can't pronounce some of the words that are in the ingredients, what is that, right?
Yes.
So, and I think we're just exposed to a lot of chemicals that we call endocrine disruptors, and they can really they can affect the nervous system of an adult or even a child. So I think that those are some of the factors. If something's on the rise, you have to look at the environment. It's like, okay, well, what's been changing, right? And those are
Yeah,
two
exactly.
really obvious things. Yeah.
So there's so many of those scientific facts that need to be researched and need to be proven. How do you choose which one, where to go and what to do with your research?
With my research or with the podcast?
All of the above. Let's start with your
Yeah.
research and then let's go to
Yeah.
your podcast.
Well, so I became an emeritus professor several years ago. So my research pretty much ended in favor of doing the podcast. But what I was interested in with my own research was things like the interaction between genetics and the environment and producing metabolic illnesses like diabetes and things like that. That was one. And the other one I was really interested in is how new species formed and looking at the genetic mechanisms that are responsible for the formation of new species. So, I mean, they were just things I've been interested in, right? And then another aspect of it was, what about the genetics of being able to withstand global warming and thermal tolerance? So we looked at a lot of things like that.
Oh my goodness.
Those are just my personal interests. And so, that's what my lab was funded to do. But with the podcast, it's much more broad than that. It's much broader.
So I'm curious. We have big time diabetes type 1 in our family, mostly on the male side. We do
Type
have
1. Huh.
Yeah, type 1,
Huh.
serious. And we're talking, my niece was diagnosed when she was, I think, 6 years old. I have two nephews that were diagnosed adolescent for sure. I mean, it's all over our family. And what's interesting is 100% of the people in our family who have type 1 diabetes also have a gluten intolerance or an allergy.
Oh,
And
interesting.
that can't be, you say if something's on the rise or you start to see a
Yeah.
correlation, it just can't, it's got to be connected. And I've never been able to actually, I don't know who to even ask. It's got to be connected. And I don't understand why.
Well, I mean, I'm not a physician, so I don't,
Right.
I don't know that much
Well, maybe
about
that's your
gluten
next study,
intolerance.
though.
Yeah, right. Well, for type 1 diabetes, we know that there are certain genes that underlie this. And they're genes that are involved in what we call the HLA system, histocompatibility, human leukocyte antigens. And there are certain genotypes for that are associated with type 1 diabetes. Now, whether there are some that are linked to that or that same gene can cause gluten intolerance or allergies, I don't know. But I'll go look into it when we're
That would
done.
be awesome.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting observation. Somebody should bring that maybe to the attention of some of their physicians, and maybe somebody could do a family analysis.
Yeah, I would very much like that because it's rampant in our family. And so,
Got to be hard to feed them.
it is very hard to feed them. And
Yeah,
we have
yeah.
found this gluten-free sourdough that is just absolutely amazing, and that has
Oh,
changed our
wow.
lives. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So, through your nonprofits, I'm going to change directions just a little bit. So, you also have a nonprofit, Sin Fronteras. How do you see that intersection of art and science driving change in communities, and why is this connection so important? And tell us a little bit about your nonprofit as well.
Well, we actually have several different branches of the nonprofit. The one for science, I became interested in the fact that a lot of my colleagues from Latin America, Sin Fronteras means without borders, okay? And that a lot of them, and I discovered this really when I was editor of the journal for my field, that if you send those papers out, their data could be very good, but if their English wasn't spot on, and the reviewers that you send them to, they could be kind of snippy. And if the English wasn't good, they would just dismiss the content. And I thought that was terrible because then you're not having representation and some good science coming from other places. So part of the intention with the nonprofit was to help these authors before they submit their paper by having someone in the field, like a young scientist, and paying that young scientist to look at the manuscript and edit it for them so that the English was good. And that's been great because the acceptance rate on their papers and publications has gone way up. So that's been very gratifying. And then to sponsor some science that could be between people from two different countries. Usually one of them being a country that there's not a lot of money for research, and so the students don't have a lot of opportunities. The other part with the art is, when you think about art historically, there have been a lot of different trends in it, but I think it's a lot like science in that when you have two different genres come together, you get something new. For example, genetics used to just be, counting blue eyes, brown eyes, albino, not albino, but merging that with molecular biology, right? That was a border, but merging it together, the synergy produced amazing things, okay? And we have molecular genetics and a lot of techniques. And I think art is very much the same way. It used to be people think, oh, they're an artist. Well, they're a painter. What do you paint? Well, maybe they're not a painter. Maybe they are doing, maybe they're a sculptor, but they've suddenly decided, I can paint this sculpture, or I can do installation art that has a lot of things going on. And those components can be drawn from different places where normally you wouldn't think of them as being in the same context, but it creates something new. And I think if you look at the history of art, it's the people that have, crossed the border, so to speak, and experimented, that I think that's where a lot of really interesting art has come from. So
Yeah.
we try to give some grants to young artists and help them show their work.
Yeah, that is such an interesting uh, connection between art and science, and it's something I wouldn't have thought of. So that's
It's
amazing that
it's
you're able to
all
build.
creativity. It's all
Yeah,
creativity.
I guess I
Yeah.
don't think of science as creativity.
Oh boy. Well, if they're not creative, they're not doing good science.
So expand on that a little bit.
Well, I mean, you have to, creativity, I think, is being able to envision new things and think about it, and
Mm,
and to ask questions. And if scientists don't do that, they're not going to find out new things. So I think
yeah,
it's people that are willing to, move outside their comfort zone. Um, and defining what creativity is it's difficult to define. You know it when you see it, don't you?
yeah, that's for
Yeah,
sure.
right. Yeah.
So I know one of your passions as well is being an advocate for women. So I'm curious what challenges that you have faced as a woman in science, and how do you advocate for greater equity today?
Mm. Well, this is a really good question. So, um, yeah, I think, what do I see as some of the challenges? I mean, in my life, some of the things that have happened have been, mansplaining, or people saying things to me like, why are you a scientist? You could have been a model or an actress. And that, or a man saying, you're taking a position away from a man who has a family to feed. Um, those are not fun things to hear. But my philosophy, in your work, at least in science, and I think in other things, that if you just keep your nose to the grindstone and do your work and be really good at it, I mean, be really good, right?
Yeah,
I think that you'll emerge victorious. I mean, it'll can be problematic, but it won't kill you. Um,
yeah.
so I think that that's important, is just to be really good so that people can't question you. Um,
Mm,
but the other thing, one thing that happened to me was actually very terrible, was that I was elected president of my professional society. Before that, I had been the editor-in-chief of the journal. And the journal rotates every 3 years to find a new editor. I was the first female editor, the only female editor in the 50 or 60 years that the journal existed. Okay. And that was great, right? Um, and then a year later, well, a new editor came on board 3 years later. And then after that, I was elected president of that society. And it coincided with a time when it was time to select the new editor, the one who was going to replace. And there was a system in place for doing that selection. There had to be nominations, and the council for the organization was supposed to vote.
mhm.
Well, I found out that the outgoing president, who was a man and a very respected scientist, had consulted with the previous editor, the outgoing editor, who was a man, and they selected the next editor. And I found out about this. I should have been in on the decision, and I was very angry. And I said, "You've got to reverse this. You've got to do a search. There were never any women even considered for this." And what emerged was so interesting, Wendy, because I said, "Okay, well, what women have you considered?" And they mentioned some names, and they said, "Yeah, but that one, she seems awfully busy. I don't think she'd be able to do it." Or this other one, there's always some excuse. "Oh, I've heard she's kind of a bitch. Well, we don't
Mhm.
want that." It's like, well, and so these women were
Yeah.
just discounted, disqualified for really silly things. And I resigned as president of the society. There was a big write-up in the scientific journals about the
Mm,
resignation, but I didn't want to be part of something where, they don't play by the rules, and
mhm,
they don't value the diversity, and to be saying things like that about women. But it was really interesting
mm.
because after those men then were editors, they did get a woman as an editor. The
Oh,
next,
they did?
yeah, yeah, you're darn right they did. Yeah.
Wow.
So it's stuff like that, I think women are discounted in a lot of ways. And, if you try to be pushy, then, oh, you're too aggressive, or they have
Mhm,
other terms that they can use for you, right?
mhm.
But they don't like it, and thinks that if a man were behaving that way, that wouldn't
Yeah.
wouldn't bother anybody. So
So how do
those
you
are
advocate for other women then, either, in your life, in your business, in your
right.
in your research?
Well, a lot of the women graduate students that I've had, I've really tried to promote them, getting them giving talks at national meetings and making sure that they're showing really well. But also a lot of it, there's a misconception among women, especially they're they're all getting their doctorates, right? And they
Mhm.
love what they do, but they also feel at some point that they have to make a choice between having a personal relationship and a career.
Hmm.
And this comes up for a lot of them because they'll have a boyfriend or whatever. And it's like, well, what's the next step? Where are we going to go to work? And it's very difficult, for example, for two young professionals to get a job at the same institution, same university.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, that's changing, but a lot of women feel that they have to make that choice. And a lot of them would actually consider giving up the career that they worked so hard to get their degree in, or taking a job that was kind of, I don't want to say beneath them, but not where they could really shine. And, to spend a lot of time talking to people about this. A colleague of mine, who's also a woman, and I have spent time talking to some of our young women grad students about it, because
Mhm.
they're concerned. And it's unfortunate. It's
Yeah.
unfortunate. I mean, I have a kid, right? And I was able to, be fairly successful in my career, and a lot of women are, but I think, so what I always tell them is, pick the right partner, right?
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, right. Yeah. So
Hmm.
I think that's, I think emotional support and trying to model for them that yes, you can do this,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And there are a lot of ways to make opportunities for women. So I try to do that on my podcast. I try to have a lot of women guests.
Hmm.
I mean, I'm not trying to not have men. I think I have a pretty good mix, but I really do try to feature women when I can.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like that's starting to change with DEI, and now we have B with belonging, and it seems like those things are starting to change. Would you say that that's true? And do you see that in your line of work?
In science at universities, in biological sciences, I do see that. Yeah,
Good.
there's a lot more women are getting their degrees, or getting postdocs, they're getting professorships,
Good.
and they're in there. Yeah, I'm not sure about what goes on in other areas. I can't
Yeah.
speak to that.
Yeah, my best friend's daughter is going to school right now in St. Louis, and she's going to be she says it's the first woman brain surgeon. Is it
Well,
true? There's no
there,
female
there,
brain
there,
surgeons?
there are, but it may
There
be
are.
in
Okay.
a particular specialty of
Yeah,
brain surgery. Yeah, I
maybe
mean,
that's what it is.
yeah,
And
it could
she's so
be.
excited, and she's looking at the same thing. She's like, I mean, there's just not a whole lot of women that are going through this specific coursework that she's endeavoring to
Right,
go through. And
right.
so I'm
And it's very
excited to
male
see.
dominated. It's
Yeah. And
really male dominated. So yeah, that's got to be tough for her, but good for her.
yeah,
She just needs to hang in there.
I know we are so proud of her.
Yeah.
She just finished, I think she's in her junior year. She just finished her semester with like a 3.9 and is taking all these classes that I can barely pronounce. And I'm
But
like,
so is she
yes.
she's not in med school yet?
She's
Or
not in med school yet. She's in her
okay. So
undergrad,
she's
and
not a
then
brain surgeon yet.
she is not. Her
Okay.
her
Okay.
mission in
Okay.
life is to become the first
Okay.
woman brain surgeon in her
Well,
field. So
good
we're
for her.
excited to
Good for
see
her.
that
That's
happening.
great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dream big, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I always say, don't say no to yourself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, she's got a dream, she's got a vision, and she's going to do it. We're pretty excited for
Wonderful.
her.
That's wonderful.
So I know that you are really passionate about, some of the subjects that that you are myth busting. I call you the modern day myth buster, so I love that about you.
I don't know.
But one of those is genetically modified foods. So talk to us a little
Yeah.
bit about what the research says about that.
Um, well, first of all, I think people, when people think about genetically modified, I think they're mainly talking about when somebody has inserted a new gene into a crop or something for a certain purpose. If you think about it, during history, there has been so much genetic modification going on. Think about when you buy an ear of corn. They're big, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're big and they're yellow and they're sweet. Well, corn didn't just originate that way. People had to select for the genes that make the corn really good, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's genetic modification because you start selectively breeding. You cross plants and breed plants only that make really big ears, and then you're increasing those genes. Same thing with dog breeds. I mean, when you think about the origin of dog breeds, it's all, genetics and breeding dogs that have characteristics that you want. Then you end up with new breeds. That's genetic modification. Now, more recently, with the advent of molecular techniques and genetics, it's possible to insert a gene for a specific trait into an organism. And, down the way, there may be some really good things happening about this for people, but I don't want to talk about that because it's not what people are squawking about. The big issue with there are two big issues that people find with genetically modified, say, corn or soybeans or something like that, are that number one, they've been genetically modified so that they can be sprayed without a problem with something called Roundup that has something called glyphosate in it. Okay. It's toxic. All right. But what it means is when you're genetically modified to be able to be sprayed with this stuff, it also increases the yield so that there's more food for people. And it's an issue of productivity, and it's economically, it's very good. Now, people are concerned that if you consume a product like corn or something that's been genetically modified, that maybe that gene can get into your genes, right, and change you. And that's a concern that a lot of people say, I don't want to eat that because I don't want the genes are going to get into my genes. The evidence for this is it's not strong, let me tell you. My concern would be more with respect to what they're spraying on these things. Okay. So anytime you have genetically modified crops, they're usually genetically modified to receive in the field applications of something that's called Roundup. And then these crops are called Roundup Ready. Why? Because if you spray them with Roundup, gets rid of all the rest of the weeds, everything else in your crop really grows well. But Roundup it contains something called glyphosate, which over the years, people began to notice that ag workers and people that were continually exposed to this started developing a lot of cancers, mainly lymphomas. And lawsuits came along, and the evidence was pretty good that it was responsible for this. And there have been some pretty big awards. So they're products that are put out by Monsanto, which Bayer had purchased. And so that to me is is a more serious issue than the genes getting into your body by some unlikely mechanism. I would be much more worried about the chemicals that are on these things. And if it's feed for animals, then the animals are consuming that, right? And it's getting into the meat or the chicken or whatever. So I think those are the big deals, I think, with genetic modification.
So what do we do? Do, how do we change how we eat, the water that we drink? Where do we start? Because it seems
That's
pretty overwhelming to me, when I
it.
think of all of the things that we could be ingesting.
Well, yeah, yeah. And the unfortunate thing is, not everybody can afford to buy organic food. They
Right.
can't. I mean, it's just really expensive. You know that. There are all these
Yeah.
jokes about you go to Whole Foods, they call it whole paycheck. And because,
Right.
but a lot of people, I mean, that's one solution is to buy organic food, but that's not available to everybody.
Hmm.
I think another solution with respect to the water is, to be very, very careful. There are places where you can check the water quality in your area because cities
Hmm.
usually have to publish from their water treatment what they're detecting, what they're eliminating, what's getting through, and so forth. So you can look at that, and you can certainly try to purify water or buy, water that is has been purified by some mechanism. There's also it's really interesting. There's something called the Environmental Working Group, EWG. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but
I've not.
it's a great group, and they evaluate all these different products, like they for cosmetics, for household cleaning, you know, solutions and things like that. And they evaluate what chemicals are in them, and they
Hmm.
rank them by their safety. And they have apps where if you go in the grocery store, you can use this app and it will tell you, are there toxins or bad things in this food? And, if there are, some of these apps, I forget what one of them is called. Oh, there are several of them.
Yeah.
EWG has one, but then there's another one. God, I
I
can't
have
remember
a
the
friend
name
that
of it.
doesn't go anywhere without that app. And it's so funny. We'll go shopping and I'll put something in my basket. She'll go, wait, wait, wait. And I'm like,
Yeah.
what?
No, but they often will then suggest a healthier alternative.
Right.
So, it's not like, well, you just can't eat anything in the store. I mean,
Mm.
that's impossible because we have to eat, we have to feed our families. But I think the apps are really useful in helping you avoid some of the things that we know are not great, but are
Yeah.
still in food,
Yeah. Such a
right?
good idea.
It is a
Gotta
good
love
idea.
technology. I didn't
Well,
even think about doing that.
that's a good one, right? That's a
Yeah.
good one.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Therese, you have done so much good for the world, for women, for all of the students that you mentor in science. And so, looking back on your journey, what's just one lesson that you hope people take away from your work, whether in science, genetics, podcasting, or your advocacy efforts?
I guess one of the most important things I think is that people look at the data, if
Hmm.
they're going to believe something or they think, oh wow, I better be careful about that, or did you hear this? I think if they can, they should try to find a way to access the original information so that they can really make, an informed decision and not just based on what they heard or what they saw from some soundbite headline on social
Right.
media. I think
Yeah,
that's
not just
really
a
important to keep
influencer
yourself
on social
safe.
media. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's very difficult. It's very, very
Hmm.
difficult.
It is.
I think that's one big thing. And then the other thing I think for young women is I love the saying, you don't say no to yourself.
Mm,
Don't say, I don't think I can do that because of blah, blah, blah. Let somebody else tell you no, just go
that's
for it.
right. Mm.
I think that's really important. And what else? I don't know. It's
Well,
probably all I can
such good
think of.
advice.
Well,
Yeah.
I
Um,
think people in the United States as taxpayers, we fund the National Institutes of Health and National Science Foundation, and they are great. I don't like to hear talk about them being underfunded by
mhm,
people that for some reason don't like science. But I think the issue is that because our tax dollars are used to support novel and important research, I think it's really important that the public understand the fruits of that research and what it means
mhm.
so that they are not misled by fake news or disinformation. And that was one of the motivations to start the show.
Yeah.
Hope it's
Well,
working.
and go there for us. What's next on Critically Speaking?
Wow. Tomorrow we are releasing an interview with a man who writes about men's issues, and he is going to be speaking about the phenomenon of mansplaining.
Oh,
Do you know what mansplaining is?
I don't.
Well, I don't know. And you hear about it, you might think, geez, maybe this has happened to me. So the term did not originate, but the concept originated with Rebecca Solnit because she had written a book that was, a really great book. I mean, she's a big time author. And she was at some sort of party or reception, and this man was talking to her and started telling her about her book and how it was a great book and how she ought to read it. He had no clue at all. She finally said, yeah, I'm the author. So that's mansplaining, right? Is a man explains things. She then wrote a book called Men Explain Things to Me. And, they'll start just not thinking, maybe is it possible this woman maybe knows a little bit more about something than I do. And I should keep my mouth closed or I'll look ridiculous. So anyway, there's a man who's a wonderful man. His name is Mark Green. He's in New York. And he advocates for men learning not how to do that and other things that they're kind of ingrained to do. And so tomorrow we are releasing the next episode with him on mansplaining.
Oh, exciting. Well, that'll be a good one. And so you'll record that tomorrow? It will air tomorrow.
Oh, no, it'll air tomorrow.
It airs tomorrow.
Probably
Okay.
like you, I record in advance. So we have them waiting. Yeah.
That's good.
And then there will be another one in January that I think will be really interesting for people. You were talking about before, the increase in things like autism and ADHD. There's also, it seems like Parkinson's is on the rise, and not just because the population is getting older. It looks like there might be some environmental factors. So I have an interview with a young neurologist who's very good about that. That'll be coming out in January.
Oh, good. Well, we'll look forward to that one, and I'll make sure that my Chloe watches that one that wants to be a brain surgeon. So that would be very interesting for her as well.
Great. Yeah,
So
very
awesome.
good. Yeah, well, this has been fun, Wendi.
It has been fun. Therese, if you could leave our audience with one piece of advice on how to make more informed decisions and where to find the truth, more informed decisions about health, society, the planet, what would it be?
Well, it would be to look a little bit deeper, not just repeat and believe the first thing you see. Look at the contrasting evidence. Where's the evidence for that point of view?
Yeah.
Be more critical.
Be a scientist.
That's what I would say. Yeah.
Look for the data.
Look for the data. Right.
All right. Well, Therese, thank you so much. And thank you for all the things that you are doing to make this world a better place. And we will look forward to tuning in to Critically Speaking.
Oh, well, thank you, Wendi. This has been a fun conversation.
It has been fun. Thanks for being a guest.
Have a great week. Bye.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Unleashed with Wendi Swanson. Make sure to subscribe and follow to be notified when the newest episodes of the podcast go live. Please take a moment to rate and review us. It helps others discover Unleashed and join our movement of forward-thinking leaders. You can find contact information and important links in the show notes. Stay tuned for the next episode, and remember, keep leading with authenticity, embrace change, and choose to live life unleashed.